IMAX. This is a recognition of the influence on my work of a guy called Professor David Bohm. It's also a kickback on the work of a guy called Daniel C. Dennett, who's an American materialist, eliminative materialist, i.e. somebody that doesn't believe that we're even conscious, but that's another aside.
Right.
And he has something he calls the Cartesian theatre. And I say we are not existing in the Cartesian theatre, we're existing in the Bohmian IMAX. Now, in the Bohmian IMAX, every single outcome of every decision is encoded in there. It means you're not predestined to do things, because everything you can possibly do is also predestined. Because effectively what I suggest is at the end of your first life in the Bohmian IMAX, you live the same life again and again and again and again. And you do it thousands, tens of thousands, possibly even millions of times. And each time you do it, you will live a different life. You'll follow a different course. You'll marry the girl from primary school you fancied. You'll take that job down in London. You won't make that terribly bad decision that you made when you were 21. You will follow through all the alternatives. And in doing so, you will eventually live the perfect life. Now, many listeners, and you guys are probably thinking, this reminds me of a movie, Groundhog Day. In fact, Groundhog Day, I was going to call the book Groundhog Life. Now, as an interesting aside, Danny Rubin, who is the guy that wrote Groundhog Day, both the story and the script, is now, Danny and I are now in contact. And Danny has actually given copies of my first book to most of his friends. He's an academic at Harvard in America, and he's actually said to me that your book intrigues the hell out of me because it does the science of my movie. Because in effect, that's what happens in the movie, doesn't it? Phil Connors, the weatherman in the movie, lives the same day over and over again. Initially, he lives the bad life, and he tries to bed the girl, and he tries to make money. And then he suddenly goes into another stage where each day he tries to expand himself by learning foreign languages, learning how to play a musical instrument. But then he starts to do good for doing good's sake. He lives the day trying to be underneath the tree to save the little boy falling out of the tree. Or he tries to help the tramp who's dying. He becomes a philanthropist. So what effectively he's doing, it's karma. What he's doing is, by living his life over and over again, he's living the perfect life. And at the end of the day, when he lives the absolute perfect life, he's allowed to move on to the next stage of existence, which could be going to heaven. It could be coming back to help his fellow human beings as an advanced being, or a samsara, or an avatar. Many, many things he could do. But effectively, all this has happened in the final second of your life. In other words, somebody watching you die, you live millions of lives in the final second of your life. And this is what I call cheating the ferryman.
So would you say the traditional idea of reincarnation is slightly different from what you're saying then?
Yeah, my hypothesis doesn't discredit reincarnation, because if you think about it, reincarnation is you dying and being reborn again. In other words, you could be reincarnated after you've been through the Bohmian IMAX many, many times. In fact, I would consider that the Bohmian IMAX is extremely Buddhist, in the sense that there is a concept in Buddhism called the Bardo state. And the Bardo state is the place between lives, the place you go between incarnations. Now, I have an open mind about reincarnation. I really genuinely don't know. But one of the things I've always thought about reincarnation is why it doesn't work for me, is that if I am reborn again as somebody else, and I don't know about my previous life in any shape or form, how on earth can I be progressing? In other words, the only way a human being can progress is by learning by their mistakes. And the only way we can learn by our mistakes is knowing what our mistakes were. But reincarnation is quite precise. You die, and then you're reborn as somebody else in a higher or lower caste, with no memory of what you did last time. So how can that be progressive? It can't be. You can't be advancing in any shape or form. All you do is you live that, each life you live in isolation. So to me, as a progressive thing, it doesn't necessarily work, but it doesn't mean it doesn't work logically. And it doesn't mean that there isn't a degree of evidence for reincarnation. If you look at the work of Ian Stevenson from the University of Virginia, he's done quite a lot, or he did do before he went off and died, but he did quite a lot of work in this area. And some of it is quite strong in its evidence.
So what about the idea of free will? How does that come into what you propose?
Well, you have the free will to make every decision within the Boman IMAX, don't you? Now, effectively, if every outcome of every decision you can make is already encoded in there, whatever decision you make, you're making a free will. You know, effectively, there is only a certain number of ways I can walk across my living room now. There is only a finite number of ways I can walk across my living room. And I can choose which way I walk across my living room. And I have free will in those, but I'm restricted by what things I can do. Free will doesn't stop. I can't fly. As far as free will is concerned, I don't have the free will to fly. So there are restrictions we have, but effectively within the restrictions we have total freedom, as we do within the Boman IMAX.
Getting back to your second book, the Daemon, you say there's two parts, the daemon and the eidolon?
The eidolon, yeah.
Eidolon, yeah.
Yeah.
And you say that they eventually become one, or is it the dyad, as you put it?
The dyad, yeah.
Could you not argue that this corresponds to the left brain, right brain scenario, or would you say it's something more complex than that?
No, it's identical to.
Yeah.
In the book, The Daemon, I have a whole section on the right and left brain. I also have a whole section on split brain operations done by people Roger Sperry and Michael Gasanaga. So I go into great specific detail about neurochemistry, neurophysiology, and neurosurgery. And I'm not if you're aware of this, but from the 1950s through to the early 1970s, there were a whole series of experiments done where individuals had their corpus callosum cut. The corpus callosum is a group of nerves that holds together, in effect, the right and left hemisphere. And when these individuals did have their corpus callosum cut, they actually became two people. There were two areas of consciousness, both of which had different ideas and different concepts. This, in many ways, explains something called alien hand syndrome. I don't know if you've come across this.
Can you explain? Yeah.
Yeah, it's people who have either had a split brain operation or they've had a stroke whereby their right and left hemispheres don't communicate. Now, as you may or may not be aware, each side of the brain is responsible for the movement of the opposite side of the body. So my right hemisphere moves my left side and vice versa. Now, when you've had a stroke that has actually stopped the communication channels, it effectively means that you, who normally inhabit your dominant hemisphere, which is normally your left hemisphere, do not have control fully over your left side of your body, which means you don't have control over your left hand. And what has happened is there's been many, many cases of people, for instance, who have gone to the wardrobe to decide what clothes to wear. And their right hand has gone out, dominant hemisphere, to pick one particular piece of clothing. And the left hand has started wrestling with them to stop them because the left-hand side of the body wants to put something on completely different. Now, again, this is a known effect. You know, this is not sort of anything weird or strange. You talk to any psychiatrist, alien hand syndrome is something they're aware of. Multiple personality syndrome is also something whereby people have different personalities inside themselves. These are all evidence of the fact that we are not just one personality. But in my daemon eidolon dyad model, I say that the non-dominant hemisphere within there is your daemon. It's your higher self. And this daemon manifests itself in many, many ways. For instance, after I wrote the first book, I received hundreds and hundreds of letters from people around the world who were sending me examples of times in their life when either a voice has warned them, where they've had a dream that has warned them to not do something, and sometimes even their hands have changed. I mean, for instance, there's one guy who wrote to me, and he was in the Rhodesian army, as was in 1969, and he was up in northern Rhodesia in a place called Mount Darwin, and he was riding on the top of an armoured vehicle, manning the machine gun. And as they were driving back, suddenly a voice in his head shouted into his ear, "Ambush, ambush, ambush." He was so shocked he didn't react. The next thing he felt was being pushed literally out of the seat he was sitting in at the top of the armoured vehicle, off the top of the vehicle into the camouflage netting at the side, touching his finger as he fell. And as he did so, a machine gun ripped into the seat where he'd been sitting. He would have received bullets right across his body and he would have been killed instantly. Whatever was that voice in his head, it knew what was going to happen next. There's another classic case, is Juan Fangio, the Formula One driver. He was actually in a race and he was coming around a blind bend. And as he did so, his hands grabbed the wheel and turned them in completely the opposite direction and sent him completely in the wrong direction on the race course. Because round the corner, where he couldn't see or hear or anything, there'd been a huge pileup. Had his hands not done that automatically, he would have gone into the back of the pileup and been killed. These are example after example after example. And funnily enough, you mentioned, that your or what used to live in Ellesmere Port. Somebody contacted me comparatively recently, where they were down in near the Mollington Bonasta Hotel, and they were in one of the country lanes along there. And as they were driving along, his father, he was in the side seat, and his sister was in the back. And his father suddenly said, "I had a dream about this yesterday. We got hit by a lorry." And his father grabbed the steering wheel and stopped in the lay-by as a lorry came plummeting past on the wrong side of the road. That is the power of the daemon. And I think the daemon is your guiding spirit. I think that people who are spiritualists, people who are mediums, the thing that guides them is their higher self, which is their daemon. And you may be interested to know that last February, I was invited to do a talk at the Arthur Findlay College in Essex, near Stansted Airport, which is one of the major training places for mediums from across the world. And I was invited by a friend of mine, Susan, who is a medium. And I was expecting to have quite a hostile response from the 70 or so mediums in the room when I did my talk on the daemon. I was amazed. The response was so positive. It was incredible. I was approached and they said, "This explains what's happening to us. It explains it scientifically, and it explains it in a way that we can take to our clients. To say the reason I know things and my spirit guide knows things is my spirit guide has lived this life before."
Right, that's quite fascinating so far. Let's move on to your third book, The Out of the Body Experience, which I believe came out last year. You begin the book by mentioning a visit you made to Switzerland, where you met up with Dr. Engelbert Winkler, and you tried out his machine called Lucia, which stimulates the brain in quite an unusual way. Could you tell us a little bit about this experience?
Sure, I certainly can. The link between myself and Dr. Engelbert Winkler was made by a friend of mine called Evelyn Alassa Valerano, who is a writer on near-death experiences, and she's written books with Kenneth Ring, who anybody's out there who knows about near-death experience knows that Kenneth Ring is one of the major guys in this field. And Evelyn works at the University of Geneva. And she contacted me because she said that one of her close friends, a consultant psychologist by the name of Dr. Engelbert Winkler, had read my first book, Is There Life After Death, and was so intrigued by it that he was desperate to meet me because it explained a lot of the things that had happened to him in his life. He'd had a near-death experience when he was a young man. She then explained to me that Engelbert and another associate of his, who's a consultant neurologist by the name of Dirk Prokol, had worked together and had designed from the bottom up a machine that, by using light, both stroboscopic light and different intensities of white light, can bring about altered states of consciousness. Now, I know that there have been many of these machines marketed over the years, and in fact I'm in the process of writing my 6th book at the moment, and I will have a whole chapter on the different applications of